Greetings, listeners. Today on the Bible Basics podcast, we're going to discuss, wait for it, genealogies. Now, before you hit that skip button, hear me out. Genealogies might seem like a snooze fest at first glance, but trust me, they're like hidden treasure troves waiting to be discovered. These meticulously recorded lists trace the ancestry of key biblical figures, anchoring them within the grand narrative of God's unfolding plan for humanity. But why should we care about these long lists of names? What's the significance? Well, buckle up, because we're about to embark on a journey through history, culture, and theology to discover why. Well, welcome everyone. I'm your host, Jackie Adewale, and this is the Bible Basics Podcast, where weekly we break down the Bible into understandable, bite-sized chunks. Let's face it, there are certain passages in Scripture that, in all honesty, we're tempted to just sort of skim or skip over. Genealogies certainly fit into that category. You might wonder why we can't just have the Cliff Notes version. Well, we do know that all Scripture is God-breathed, according to 2 Timothy 3:16, and so it's beneficial. We know that God ultimately is the one who wanted these genealogies recorded for our benefit. So it's important to understand the significance of genealogies and what they mean for us. First things first, what exactly are biblical genealogies? These are lists of names that trace the lineage of key figures throughout the Bible, from Adam and Eve all the way down to the time of Jesus and beyond. They're concentrated in the Old Testament, although the genealogy of Jesus occupies a foundational place in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. I have a book called All the Genealogies in the Bible by Nancy S. Dawson. She charts 250 Old Testament genealogies and almost 50 in the New Testament. Can you imagine? Well, now you might be wondering, well, why are they significant? Well, here are 4 reasons. There are many more. First, they serve as a testament to the fulfillment of divine promises. The meticulous recording of lineage, particularly in the case of Jesus Christ, underscores the fulfillment of messianic prophecies and the continuity of God's covenant with his people. The Messiah was prophesied to come from the line of David. That's in Isaiah 11:1. By recording his lineage in Scripture, God confirms that Jesus was descended from David. These genealogies are in Matthew 1:1-17, and Luke 3:23-38. Can you imagine if we didn't have the genealogy of Christ? Anyone could claim they were the Messiah, and we would have little or no assurance of those claims. Inheritance was another reason genealogies were significant. When the Hebrews began to manage large herds and flocks and to live together in families and tribes, genealogies became very important in deciding inheritance rights and land allotments. When land holdings had been distributed to the Israelite tribes in Canaan, a person could only lay claim legally to ancestral property by producing the proper genealogical records. A third reason why they're significant is that certain office holders, especially kings and priests of Israel, were eligible to serve only if they could prove their credentials to hold a particular hereditary office. Genealogies were essential for the preservation of the exclusively hereditary priesthood that had been established by the Mosaic Law. When the Jewish captives returned from Babylon to Jerusalem, a register of their genealogies was made. That's in Nehemiah 7:5. These genealogies proved very useful in deciding who was qualified by birth to act as priests, and we see that in Nehemiah 7:64. And as you know, the priesthood of Israel was essential to worshiping God in holiness. If this procedure was vital for the welfare of the priesthood, it was equally so for the royal succession in the kingdom of Judah, which traced its descent from the family of David. When the prophets proclaimed that the Messiah would also come from the ancestry of Jesse, the father of David, even greater precautions were taken to preserve the pattern of descent. See Isaiah 11:1. And finally, collectively, the genealogies show the family of God, which is composed of Jews and Gentiles who came to hold the faith of Abraham, the father of us all. Romans 4:16. Examples include the Israelite patriarchs and matriarchs, as well as non-Israelites who were brought into the family, such as Rahab, the Canaanite harlot of Jericho, and Ruth, the Moabite, both of whom married into the tribe of Judah. See Joshua 2 and Ruth 1-4, respectively. So, genealogies establish a sense of identity for the people of Israel and for us who are in the household of faith. Now, let's look at an example. Let's consider some of the things biblical genealogies can tell us. We'll focus on Genesis 10. This chapter contains a genealogy of Noah's descendants. It starts with Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, who each had sons after the great flood. This genealogy is commonly referred to as the Table of Nations. It's a list of the founders of 70 nations that descended from Noah through his 3 sons. But Genesis 10 concerns more than just individuals in a genealogy. Tribal names and regional place names also appear in this list. Note that this is not a complete listing of every direct descendant of Noah's sons. This table of nations is structured as a mixture of the 2 types of Old Testament genealogies. There's the linear form, which shows straightforward father-son succession and is characterized by depth. And then there's the segmented form that shows multiple offspring of a parent or ancestor with the lineages or branches forming a family tree and exhibiting both depth and breadth. Most genealogies in Scripture are of this segmented type. Oh my goodness. I took some time to really look at this genealogy in Genesis 10. I even drew it out on paper. There is so much to learn. For example, a while back, one of our podcast listeners asked that we consider an episode on the identity of all those tribes or nations that Israel was always fighting against, that ends with ITES or ites. You know what I'm talking about. The Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, and more. Well, I see the answer in this genealogy. Genesis 10:6 reads, "The sons of Ham, Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan." Well, that's surprising. One of Ham's sons was Canaan? And then, if we move to verse 15, it reads, Canaan was the father of Sidon, his firstborn, and of the Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, Girgashites, Hivites, Archites, Sinites, Arvadites, Zemarites, and Hamathites. There you are. The land God promised to his chosen people was called Canaan. We can see that Canaan was the son of Ham, and Canaan was the father of so many of those nations that end with the ites that Israel had to conquer to possess the land. Who knew? Let's look at one more aspect of this fascinating genealogy. Check out the descendants of Shem. This is a significant one. Shem's great-great-grandson was Eber. It's believed that name Eber was also translated Hebrew. What is significant about that? Abraham and his seed, God's covenant people, descended from Eber, and they were called Hebrews. Abraham is first called the Hebrew in Genesis 14:13. We did an episode that explored where that label Hebrew came from. It's titled Exploring the Biblical Terms, Hebrew, Israelite, and Jew. The link for that episode is in the show notes. So Genesis 11 continues Shem's genealogy, and it shows us that Shem was the ancestor to Abraham's father, Terah, and Abraham himself. What? That shows Abraham was a descendant of Shem? Of Noah? And back in chapter 10, it says Noah was descended from Adam? So let's take a giant leap forward to the New Testament, the book of Matthew, chapter 1, and look at Jesus' genealogy. What's the first name in Jesus' genealogy? Abraham. That's right. This shows us how the descendants of Shem would play a major role in the great plan of God's redemption of creation. Our redemption came through a people, the Hebrews, and eventually through the person of Jesus, the son of Abraham. The genealogy of Noah's family adds to this unfolding pattern by establishing his son Shem as the ancestor of that messianic line. By the way, Shem in Hebrew means name, as though anticipating, quote, the name that is above every name, unquote, Philippians 2:9. The genealogy in chapter 11 now concentrates on these descendants of Shem. They'll be the Hebrews who are rescued by God from slavery in Egypt to become his chosen race of Israel, living in the promised land of Canaan. Although God has special dealings with the descendants of Shem, he has an ultimate purpose for all nations. His plan is to draw the whole earth into his perfect kingdom and saving love. In conclusion, I'd like to point out that these genealogies in the Bible demonstrate God's attention to detail and his interest in the people of his creation. God doesn't view his kingdom as a vague group of people. He knows each name with specificity and precision for their purpose. God's blessings to the families of the Bible are not as clear without the genealogies in the Bible. Through family lineage, God exemplifies how he uses everyone to fulfill his purpose. The next time you encounter a genealogy in the pages of Scripture, don't skip over it. Pause to consider the profound significance it holds. Behind each name lies a story of God's sovereignty, grace, and unyielding love for his people. Slow down and consider why the author would include this ancestry at all. Ask yourself, why is this genealogy placed here in this book? How does it set things up and anchor us in the grand narrative of God's unfolding plan for humanity, which is being told? What would be missing if these details were not included? With tenacity and perseverance, you can uncover a hidden gem that deepens your faith and understanding of God's love, his providence, and his glorious plan of salvation. If you found this episode helpful, informative, or inspirational in any way, would you please share with someone you know who needs to hear it? You can do that by sharing the podcast's website, bible-basics.org, or you can click on the share button right where you're listening now. For those of you listening on YouTube, go ahead and like, subscribe, and leave us a comment. In closing, may the grace and peace of God be with you now and always.